Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we're going to be talking about domestication of insects and domestication by insects. A little bit about domestication in a class of animals we don't typically think of as domesticated. So I hope you enjoy this video. Let me know if you like it and you want to see videos like it in the future. So when we think about insects, we often think of them as commensal organisms living alongside human beings, but not usually interacting with them. Sometimes we think of them as pests or parasites, which, like mosquitoes and cockroaches, is generally true. But there's also many types of insects, many species and groups that are considered domesticated. And there's also been arguments that certain species of insects have actually domesticated other organisms. So we'll talk a little bit about them too, because why not? So the most common kind of domesticated insects are those that are used for food. About 2 billion people in the world rely on insects for a source of macronutrients like proteins and fats, but also micronutrients as well. They're a pretty interesting collection of organisms that we'll see. So everything from edible crickets to mealworms to giant water bugs, palm weevils, black soldier fly larvae, all those sort of things. These ones are species that humans are directly eating. The interesting thing about insects is that they're able to convert waste products into high quality protein sort of things. This is kind of where that, World Economic Forum, so, live in the pod, eat the bugs kind of stuff comes from. It's probably not super efficient for humans to be directly consuming the insects, but it's an actual interesting thing, especially for animal feeds. You can get these insects and raise them en masse. They're a lower quality protein that humans tend not to find appealing, but they could be fed to food animals and then turn into more palatable forms of protein. So these insects are very useful in that kind of regard. But you may be eating insects and you may not know it. So natural red food dye is actually made by the cochineal insect. If you look at the food ingredient list, carmine is actually made from these little cactus bugs, these cochineal bugs. They live on these cacti and they're harvested and then ground up into a nice red food dye, basically. It's also used for fabrics and paints and that kind of thing as well. There is also, if you ever heard of shellac, all those kind of glossy coatings on candies. It's actually made from the lac insects. It forms this nice kind of lacquer-like substance, which gives it that kind of shiny coat. So you've probably eaten the products of insects that way. Now, there's almost one food group that's made by an insect that you've almost certainly eaten, and that is honey. Honey is produced by the domestic honeybee. So there's many different species of honeybee. So of course there's the bumblebees and the stingless bees, which aren't honeybees, but they're often are nowadays being domesticated for use in greenhouse for pollination. But now we have, also the honeybees, which have been, living alongside humans and domesticated for thousands of years. The most common form of the domesticated honeybee is the species Apis mellifera, the western honeybee. And this honeybee is famous for producing large hives of upwards of 30,000 individuals, basically, mostly workers that are going out to flowers, pollinating them, and then bringing back nectar, which ferments, and they basically turn it into honey. They also produce a wax-like product from the wax glands, which is also used by human beings for making candles, lubricating, waterproofing, that sort of thing. And we know that humans have been using these kind of substances for at least 9,500 years, that kind of thing. So it's been a long sort of process. We have images from ancient Egypt of people making artificial beehives so that bees can actually go and form their nests there. Until relatively recently, the way to harvest honey was basically to destroy the hive and then have the swarm go and the bees swarm and form a new hive somewhere else. But in the 19th century, they actually developed movable frames so that you can remove the frame of the hive without destroying the actual thing. Now, honeybee domestication is actually kind of accelerated in the last 150 years or so. In 1885, McLean actually was the first person to describe artificial insemination of the queen bee. So they took sperm from a drone and they actually inseminated it into the female honeybee. This allows for controlled breeding. And this is actually a big process in modern honeybee hives to control the genetics. Some things that they're looking for especially are disease resistance, specifically to varroa mites and to certain bacterial infection like American foul brood and that kind of thing. But there's quite a lot of diversity in these kind of bees that is being lost because of the selective breeding. A lot of our food plants depend on these insect pollinators. So mostly honeybees because they're domesticated and we know what to do with them that way. And they're moved all across the world in order to do these kind of major pollination events. So if you ever heard about the almond harvest in California, that's actually moving thousands of beehives into this one very small area of California so that they can go and pollinate the flowers that way. So I would say that honeybees, some people have questioned whether or not they are domesticated, but there's actually certain traits of honeybees that show domestication. So such as they have lower aggression. If you've ever heard of Africanized bees or African honeybees, they're a version of the Apis mellifera that's common in Africa that is much more aggressive than the European forms of the honeybee. And that's because they have to defend their hives against a lot of different predators, everything from up to elephants trying to knock down their hives to primates like humans trying to steal their honey, but also other kinds of animals like honey badgers, that kind of thing too. We also have some evidence that bees, with the human beings having these active relationships with them and deliberately kind of getting them together, that means that there's kind of a domesticated relationship forming. There's also been some evidence that bees are that are bred by humans are less likely to swarm and form a new hive somewhere else. So that is indication that they are more reliant on human beings for their reproduction. One insect that is unambiguously domesticated that have been bred by humans for thousands of years is actually the silkworm moth and the silkworm caterpillar. So sericulture, which is the fancy name for actually making silk, was first developed in China about 7,500 years ago, but it didn't really take off until about 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, and that was then transferred over to the Roman Empire later on. Now, silkworms can only live, silkworm caterpillars to be more precise, can only live on the mulberry leaves of the mulberry tree. So this is a tree that's also grown so that these silkworms could have food to grow. Once they pupate, they form a nice little silk cocoon. Now, these pupa are then boiled alive and killed, which isn't very humane if you think about it, to form a nice long silk fiber, and then that can be woven into silk products. This is a tens of billions of dollar industry, even though it's a very small portion of the world's kind of textile market. The adults are very interesting, and they show clear signs of a kind of form of a domestication syndrome, a different mechanism than typically we see in mammals, but very similar sort of things. They're incredibly tame and easy to pick up, so they're very friendly. They're not aggressive, and they don't try to fly away or anything like that. Even if they were aggressive, adult silkworm moths don't have any mouth parts. They're not meant to be eating, they're meant to be breeding. They're completely reliant on human beings for protection, and they only do well basically indoors in controlled temperature and humidity settings. They're unable to fly on their own, so they have very shrunken wings. They could flap around quite a lot, but they can't produce any lift with them. They also show signs of leucism, which is basically loss of camouflage and lightening of the skin color, basically. Most of the silkworms are destroyed as pupae, but a few of them are left to breed in captivity, and that produces the next batch of silkworm moths. The silkworm pupae and the caterpillars are also eaten by humans, so they are used as a food substance themselves. Another form of domesticated insect that you may not think about is actually Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly. Human beings have been domesticating them for the last 150 years, specifically for scientific research. Now, the benefit with fruit flies is that, unlike other animals, they breed relatively rapidly in captivity. They're very cheap and easy to keep, and most people don't have a problem with people doing weird scientific experiments on them. Unlike mice and rats, where some people can have like an empathetic sort of reaction to them, most people aren't going to threaten, make bomb threats or do sorts of terrorism against people who are doing fruit fly research. I don't know, maybe that'll change in the next 100 years. But typically, fruit flies kept in captivity are low priority for most animal activists, that kind of thing. So most research institutions are pretty comfortable using these as a scientific model organisms. The first fully, decoded genome is of an organism was actually a Drosophila. So it was a fruit fly that they took the entire genome and they were able to get all the base pairs and kind of get the whole genetic code. It's also a species that has been widely studied for knockout mutations. So they find a gene, and they basically say, you're no longer active, we'll see what you do. And this causes changes to development of the organism and changes to its function. And so that research has been very good for finding out lots of things about how development works, making drug targets, and kind of learning more about biology. They've actually done studies that they could actually reverse the effects partially of domestication in Drosophila by basically, raising them in more naturalistic settings for them. And they found that they lose their tameness and they become a lot less easy to handle over, a series of like 100 generations or so. But these could also be, you could also take wild type Drosophila and domesticate them. It takes about 120 generations, which sounds like a lot, but these guys reproduce quickly. I mean, this is fruit flies, they reproduce rapidly that way. So there's quite a few domesticated insects. There's also debates about whether insects could be domesticators themselves. Now, this kind of goes back to Aristotle, and I've talked about him before in one of my previous videos. And Aristotle believed that a lot of insects, like honeybees especially, lived in kind of like city-state-like structures like in ancient Greece, a polis. And this idea of the nest being a city or a household is kind of carried on through Western kind of intellectual tradition. And this is why some people claim that insects are a domesticator species when they have domesticated species living among those nest areas. Now, we could debate the cultural sort of aspects of this because these aren't culturally determined domestications like human beings are doing. There's no technology that they're employing to keep these domesticates alive. They're not using any kind of ritualistic aspects or social learning aspects in order to keep them. There's actually more of a mutualistic coevolution between a domesticator and domesticated species. Now, whether or not that classifies as domestication proper is kind of debatable, but I'll leave that for you to discuss and decide amongst yourselves. So what species have been considered domesticated? Well, if you think about it, there's actually some pretty cool evidence that ants, termites, and what we call ambrosia beetles actually can farm fungi within their nests. And this has been described as a domestication, or multiple domestications as it turns out. Ants seems to have one common ancestor for this kind of fungal farming. Termites, there seems to be one common ancestor. And then in the ambrosia beetles, it seems to have arisen at least like 7 times, that kind of thing. So there's multiple different times that insects have domesticated fungi, which is really cool. Now, the most advanced form of this is our leafcutter ants. If you've ever seen the little videos of those ants in South America that are carrying little pieces of leaves and bringing it back to their nest, they're not actually eating the leaves. They are unable to digest the cellulose in the leaves. What they're doing is they're feeding it to a kind of fungus that lives inside of their nest. And this fungus can only exist within the nest and is unable to reproduce on its own. These leafcutter ants actually have their own specialized organ for carrying the spores when they set up a new nest. So these are dependent on the fungi for their survival, and the fungi is dependent on them for their survival. So it's a complete mutualism. They're unable to exist without the other, basically. And these ants aren't able to eat anything other than the fungi. The ants are taking very close care of these fungi, and this is seen in other kinds of domesticator insects as well. They actually have enzymes in their saliva which are antibiotics, so they basically are clearing out little bacterial infections to the fungi. They're removing mites that are on the fungi as well, and they're basically tending to it by feeding these like pieces of leaves and cellulose, that kind of thing. So we see this kind of mutualistic interaction, and to a certain extent you can describe domestication as a form of mutualism, codependence and co-reliance between two different species from radically different parts of the taxonomic tree. But whether or not that counts as a domestication in and of itself is subject to a lot of debate. If you think about it, the eukaryotic cell that has a nucleus with organelles in it is actually a form of a domestication. The cell is a domus, a household, and you have little chloroplasts and mitochondria, which have their own genetic codes and are symbiotically living within that cell. I think that might be stretching the definition a little bit that way. I think there's still an important thing to be said about the role of culture. And describing the insects and anthropomorphizing them to give them a role of having a culture and having a household, maybe making them a little too human. And I think that understanding the unique roles that human beings play as domesticators of this natural world is important to keep in mind. So that's what I have to say about domesticated insects and insects as domesticators. So I hope you had some thoughts about this video. Leave a comment in the comment section below, like the video, share it, whatever. I will see you next time. Peace.